Hi everyone. In this first video for week 5, we're going to look at how to paint our meshes using color, using textures, at least the suggestion of a texture, and using what are called matcaps or different individual materials that would give our model a more interesting surface quality, be it something that's shiny, matte, translucent perhaps. And we'll look at how all of these things sort of work together to create something that looks a little bit more realistic. So under this week's module on DC Connect, there should be two. This is a little bit pared down, but by the time it's uploaded, you'll see more here. But you should see two zip files that you can download, one called Week 5 Practice Files, and the other one called Free Sample Matcaps. So we'll be using the files that are in these folders, in these zip folders, in the demos. So if you wanted to follow along, you can download them and try your hand at what I'm doing on screen. Um, so to begin with, in that zip file, there should be an SGL file called elephant demo.sgl. There's some extra files here that's not going to be in yours, but I'm going to open that up in SculptGL because it's a continuation of the elephant demo that we did 2 weeks back. So I'm going to go to SculptGL. Here it is right now. And I'm going to first clear the scene. This is a fresh instance of SculptGL, by the way. But the first thing I'm going to do is clear the scene, which will delete everything. The reason I'm doing that is because if I don't, then when I put the elephant into this model space, into the program, it'll be inside the sphere, and we don't want that. So I'm going to go to Files, Import, Export. I want to make sure I check off Scale and Center. I'll go to Add. And the file I'm looking for, and there won't be quite as many in yours, it's called elephant demo.sgl. Remember, SGL is the native format for SculptGL. So it'll take a few seconds to load. There it is. So this is, again, similar to the model that I was showing you, the process of beginning the process using the model sheet as a background. I did a little bit more work since then. Mostly I fixed up the toenails, even though I'm still not quite happy with the feet, so don't judge me on those. I worked on the face a bit more, the ears, added a little bit more structure to the legs and to the body. Now, right now, by default, because it's saving the settings that were in the file when I saved it before, the wireframe is now on. So that's why it looks like it's a little bit darker than it normally would be. You can see the faces. Because I'm going to be painting it, I'm going to assume that I'm done most of my modeling. I'm not going to make any more major changes to this mesh if I'm going to take the next step, which is painting. The reason is that as soon as I add any kind of color to the surface of the mesh, if I try to change that model afterwards, it's going to get extremely distorted. And I'm going to basically waste my time because I'll have to delete the color and redo it. So think of this as a final step. I know it seems exciting to be able to add color to your model and give it a little bit more visual interest, but that's at the end when you're happy with the model and you just want to bring it to life. And the whole idea here is that we're making it visually interesting enough. Again, we're not aiming for photorealism here because it's more of a sketching with color than with a something like a professional rendering program might give you. But we can actually get away with quite a bit, even though it is a fairly basic program. We're going to bring this basic clay object to a place where we can present it in a digital format. And I know that For most of you, you're probably more comfortable drawing with your or drawing or painting your posters for this assignment, and that's fine. You don't need to do a digital poster, but I'm going to show you how you can add color to your mesh, make it look like it's painted, give it some life, and then in a separate video, we'll look at making a basic digital poster for the assignment, which again is an optional step, but it might, if you're comfortable doing it, it might save you some time, because once you've done all the work on in SculptGL, getting the 2D graphics out of the program is actually not that difficult. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn the wireframe off. I'm going to hit the W key, but if you don't want to do that, it's also under rendering, and then there's a wireframe option. So I'm just going to hit W. Oops, W. So that's the other thing I forgot to mention when I imported the file. Everything was deselected. That's why it was all grayed out. As soon as I select the body, you can see it gets brighter, and everything else like the tusks, the eyes, the toenails, they're dark because they're separate objects. Remember, I built this using multiple spheres to make this object. So that's going to help us when it comes to coloring things in, because I can color the body without worrying about making the eyes and the tusks and the toenails the same color or the same material. Even I can make them shinier or more reflective or less reflective if I want to. So that's another advantage of using multiple spheres. So again, I had to click the body first, and then I was able to turn the wireframe off. And as soon as I do that, you can see that if I switch between it, you can see that those visible triangles, although they were helping us, look at the quality of the mesh and make sure that we don't get too much distortion while we're modeling. Once I turn it off, you can see that it's actually still fairly smooth, and that's because I don't want to put too much fine, minute detail into the surface of this model, because I'm going to approach this from a perspective of having two different versions of my model. I'm going to have one where it doesn't really get any crazier than this in terms of surface texture, because if I'm going to if I'm going to print this model at a scale of, let's say, I don't know, that's roughly, let's say that's roughly 50 millimeters, maybe a little bit more. As you can see, if I get really crazy with that, getting the cracks in the skin, that pachyderm skin, I'm not going to see most of it in the finished model. So why bother doing that in the actual print? Now, the difference here is that I'm going to make something that's for digital presentation. It's only for a virtual format. In that case, I can go as crazy as I want. I could add a little bit more actual 3D texture using those alpha brushes that I showed you previously. But for now, I'm going to do it all using paint. So this would be a good basic, pared down texture version of my model. And as it happens, the color that I add to the model isn't going to change the quality of the print, because that color information is not relevant to the type of printing the type of printing I do. Later on in the course, we'll look at different kinds of printers that you might not have access to as an individual, at least you wouldn't be able to have the printers themselves at home, but there are printers that will print in full color, and we'll look at those later on. For now, though, I'm going to be approaching this from the perspective of making a poster, presenting this model virtually. And that's important to do because sometimes, possibly like this year, you may not be able to print it, and you want to be able to show it at its best whenever possible. So I've turned the wireframe off, and there's a lot of rambling. I just want to give you guys a lot of context what I'm doing here and why I'm going to bother to do it, aside from the fact that it's actually kind of fun. But I'm looking at this. I want to just draw attention to the quality of the surface. I added some fairly exaggerated folds. That actually does, I think at least, give you the effect of that sort of looser, saggier skin that you see in an elephant. But again, it doesn't have those crazy cracks and fissures that you see everywhere. But there's enough there to break up that sort of plasticky, uh, you know, that sort of Play-Doh effect that you can sometimes get. Um, and the way I did that was just using the crease tool, using sort of using the positive and the negative versions of the crease tool, and smoothing it out afterwards, and that gives it a little bit more structure rather than it just being a plain surface. And if I look down here, I even played with the tail a little bit. Now, in a real elephant, the tail comes to these wispy hairs. That wouldn't print, obviously. That wouldn't even resolve in a very good way. So I just gave it a suggestion of a different texture at the end there. We also made sure that the tail wasn't too thin. It doesn't matter that it does thin out here because it's not supporting any weight. And again, everything else is fairly, it's got some character, but it's not too crazy in how much, hyper detail it has. So when it comes to coloring this mesh, again, because it's made from different spheres, the body itself is one sphere. I can select that separately. First, what you need to do is decide whether you're going to work from light to dark or dark to light, kind of like painting a basic acrylic painting on a canvas. I prefer to go light to dark, so that's what I'm going to do. But again, depending on your creature and depending on what you like to do, you can do your own thing. So if I go down to tools, I can switch over to paint. And as soon as I do that, you can see that there is a color swatch here. It's a little basic. I'll give you that. But it's enough for now because, again, we're just basically sketching with color. So the first thing I'm going to do is choose a base color that everything is going to be layered on top of. Because the whole idea here is that we're going to start with one plain kind of base coat and then build it up using highlights, lowlights, and texture. So elephants are very often not actually that gray. They're a little bit brown. So this color that it has right now and this sort of innate color that's in the material isn't too bad. But I want to show you that relationship because one of the things we need to understand is how the color we're painting with, how it relates to the material that we're painting onto. So if you remember from a few classes ago when we're looking at the actual materials under rendering, under Matcap, the default is Skin Hazardous Arts 2. Right, that's the default. And if I change it to something else like red clay, it does have a dramatic effect, not only on the color, but also the way that the light hits that object. It looks like it's being lit more from up here now, and the shadows and the low lights are a lot more pronounced. Whereas if I go back to the original Skin Hazardous Arts 2, it's much better for sculpting because it's evenly lit. It's very, very matte. Sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad for what you want to bring life to. So I'm going to leave it on the default for now, just to show you what I mean. But if I go back to the paint settings down here, I want something. Now, when you're selecting the swatch, it's gonna show you what the whole thing would look like in that color. It's not coloring the whole thing. It's just a preview for your eye. But I'm gonna choose something that's sort of on the pale side, sort of a pale gray. It doesn't matter if it's reddish or brownish right now, because it's going to be so washed out. It does give you a hex code, color code for that color if you wanted to refer back to it. If anyone's familiar with HTML color coding. So there's the color. Right now, it hasn't done anything. I've just selected the color. If I go and get my brush out and start painting, you can see that it's going to paint directly onto the mesh. There's not a huge difference. And you might wonder, well, that doesn't look quite like what I selected. It looks a lot browner. And that's because what it's doing is blending the color of the paint that I just selected, the swatch, and the color in the material. So if I undo that, I can choose to hit Paint All, this button right above the color selection. You can see here there is a color picker as well in case you wanted to reselect a color you were using before. That's useful. But if I hit Paint All, it will flood the entire object, in this case the body, because that's one sphere object, with that color. But you can see that it's still kind of brown. It's not really that gray that I was actually selecting. That's actually not a bad thing for this particular creature, but you might not like the fact that it's actually altering that color. There's always that mixing going on. So if I wanted a true color difference, or true color, so I'm just going to undo what I just did. That's the color. I just hit Control Z to show you, or Command Z if on a Mac. That's the color of the material, which is the Skin Hazardous Hearts 2. If I again paint all, that's the color of the paint's color I've selected right here, combined with the color of the material. So I'll undo that again to go back to the base color of the Skin Hazardous Arts 2 material, the Matcap as it's called. If I go back up here, under Matcap, I'm going to select instead white. And white is as basic neutral color that it allows you to have right now. It's still lit a little bit differently, but you can see that it's now this sort of grayish ashen color. Again, all the color that you see is coming from the shadows, and the base color is white. And to show you the difference, if I go back to the color that I had, if I now hit Paint All, it's actually a lot truer to that color. It's not being mixed with anything else because the base is white. To make it even more obvious, if I undo that, I can go back up here and hit, let's say, red clay, or not red clay, but just clay, which is this really strong orange color. And if I go back down here, if I hit Paint All, again, all it did is really get dark. It didn't really add the color. And if I try to paint on it instead, you can see that all it's doing is getting dark. And that's because of the qualities of that Matcap. Versus if I go back, I'll undo that, and then switch back to white as my Matcap under the rendering tab here. And I go back down here and I start painting, you can see there is a much more pronounced difference in the color. It's not being blended with anything. So that's why I've selected white as my Matcap as a base for the body. And I'm just going to flood it, the whole thing, using Paint All. Now I've got that base. Again, it's not going to stay that way. That's just our prime code. Now it gets a little bit more interesting because you can start adding a really kind of quick cheat, and this goes for any model, no matter what it is. If you really want to give it a bigger, much more pronounced sense of depth, is to take a really dark color, even if it's just pure black, and I'm going to essentially darken everything underneath the animal to make it even more obvious that it's in shade, that it's it has a little bit more visual depth to it. And the trick here is that under the tool, the paint tool settings, I'm going to dial back the intensity, dial back the hardness. If I don't do that, if I have the intensity and the hardness up, I can show you, it's actually quite sharp. There is still, it's obviously still like an airbrush, but it's actually quite intense. Versus if I turn those two settings down quite dramatically, it's a lot less harsh as I go over the object. And I'm going to rotate the camera until I'm looking underneath the elephant. And I'm just going to, the first thing I'm going to do is just darken. That might be a little bit too dark. So let's take the intensity and the hardness down again and up the radius a bit. I'm just going to go over the belly and the underside of the animal, even the underside of the feet, because they are going to be hitting the ground. At least they should be. And I'm just going to give the underside of the animal a bit of counter shading. And it's really the simplest thing. I know it seems a little bit silly, but as soon as I turn, and I can even do the same thing inside the creases between the legs, anything that's sort of receding from the eye, just touching it a little bit with some darker color can do wonders for uh, that sense of depth and sense of life. And even go down the back of the legs, although here it should be fairly well lit. Under the mouth a bit. And again, because all these other parts, like the tusks and the eyes, are different spheres, I don't have to worry about changing them right now. But as you can probably, if you want to, think ahead, what I'll probably do is just make those white to make them really pop. But first, I'm going to work on the body a bit more. And again, all I did was use black and go over the base, the underside, sorry, of the animal. And even with that, I'm already getting quite a bit of visual interest um, in those parts of the model. Now comes the more exciting, even more exciting part, because I could play around with the intensity and the hardness of my brush and make it really small. I can go in, for example, and darken the inside around the eye. It's not going to make the eye black, just the area, that little, oops, so if, see what happened, I very careful. I accidentally selected the sphere, which let me now paint on the eye, which I don't want. So I'm going to undo that and then select the body again. And that way you can sort of, it's almost like adding a bit of eyeshadow. And I did have symmetry on. I forgot to mention that. I did have symmetry on because right now this is still a very symmetrical object. I haven't added any asymmetry. And again, you can go in and start, that's a little bit too extreme there, but wherever you think there should be some more flair to it. That's a little bit too intense, I think. So I'm going to undo that and just take the intensity all the way down, not the roughness rather, but by the way, there are options to change the qualities of the material down here with roughness and metallic effects, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't really do much in this version of SculptGL, unfortunately. So that's a little bit more subtle, as you can see. I'm not adding what looks like a smudge of charcoal, just sort of adding a bit of shadow. Same here in the creases, little wrinkles in the trunk. Maybe between the toes a little bit, make it a little bit darker. Oops, same idea there. I want to be careful about not painting on the toes. And if you decide I don't like it, I'm not sure about that, I can always go over it again. I can always undo that part for now. Because it might actually be nice if the feet are a little bit paler than the midsection of the leg, but we'll see what we get. The tail should definitely be darker. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is supposed to be a quicker demo, but you get the idea. Again, I could just use my brush this way, especially if you're comfortable doing that, and you can get a lot of detail that way just by painting, just by drawing on it directly. But I'm going to use a bit of a cheat by using one of those alpha brushes, or at least in this case, 2 alpha brushes, to add a bit of color and texture at the same time. So if you remember last week, we made one of the brushes I made in the demo. I don't know if it was last week or previous week when I showed you how to make a custom brush. This is one of the ones I made, which is the sort of cracked mud riverbed. Believe it or not, that's actually going to work pretty well as a way of giving you that idea of elephant skin texture. again, the idea of it's not going to be completely realistic. And the other one I made using a picture of a elephant skin that wasn't in the demo. I just did that on my own time. Is called Elephant Skin Fold, and both of these should be in that zip file for this week's demo files. And the reason I made this one is because it has this really pronounced skin fold here, kind of like what's going on where the legs meet the body on our elephant. And it's also a little bit finer, the sort of the texture of it. So I have something that's a bit coarser, like the mud cracks, and a bit finer. I can sort of mix and match. So just like when we were sculpting using these alpha brushes, you can also add them as a alpha for painting. So what I'm going to do is go down to alpha. I'm still on the paint tool. Go down here where it says alpha. Right here it says texture none, but I'm going to hit import. And I'm going to try that elephant skinfold.png, that alpha that's in the demo pack for this week. And the first thing that happens is, as you can see, if I start drawing on the mesh, it doesn't look like much. If I zoom in, you can see it looks a little bit pixelated. I'm going to undo that. And that's because, again, I want to make sure that I hit, under the alpha settings, hit lock position. That's going to let me place the alpha and scale it at the same time. And so remember how I dialed down the intensity and the hardness? I'm going to bring it all the way back up, because you want, if you're going to use a alpha, you kind of want it to be as high fidelity as possible most of the time. I'm going to up the radius a bit. And you can play with the radius of the tool versus how close you are to the model, because sometimes it's the same thing. You just zoom out and it's going to affect more of the model at once. But let's see what happens. So I have lock position on, and I kind of want to try to mostly match that skin fold in the brush with the skin fold of the model. And it's still going to be a bit, again, pixelated. It doesn't seem to read images as well. But you can see what I did. I kind of lined up that skin fold with some of the folds on the body. And even though it's a little low res, it actually does look pretty good. So the other thing to point out with this brush, if we look at this brush on the just the sort of the alpha for the actual file itself, it's looking. I'm just going to go back to the model. It's looking like whatever is black in the model is actually going to give you color. So I might be wrong about this, but it looks like it's reversed, where in the sculpting mode, whatever is white is actually raising the mesh. It's giving you that height. Here it seems to be the opposite, where whatever's white is actually just no color at all. I would play with that to be sure, but that seems to be the case. I might be wrong. So I'll do the same thing on the other side. So with that lock position, I'm just clicking where I kind of want to place it, and then I'm dragging the mouse outward to scale it and rotate it. That looks pretty good right there. Again, because I have symmetry on, it's doing the same thing to the other side. So with just two mouse clicks with a little bit of dragging the mouse, I've got quite a bit of visual interest going on in very quick order. And the other one I want to look at is that one called that dried mud.png, which is the other brush. This one, again, is going to be a little bit more high res and also much larger, the actual image. So I have to be careful, because if I'm, as you can see, it's because it's a lot higher res. Actually, this is a better one to look at. So let's see, the cracks are white, and the tops of the those mud pieces are actually black. So let's look at the brush. It's called dried mud. Yeah, so that's what I thought. So the cracks were the ones that were white with no color. Basically the color of the base color that we already flooded the model with, and it's the actual parts that are lighter in the brush that are giving us the color that we've selected. So go back here. As you can see, that's a bit harsh compared to everything else. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to dial back that intensity. But I'll probably keep the hardness because I want it to be crisp. Now with that intensity dialed back, I can start painting the rest of the body. And again, I can just keep rotating it as I go. And it's good to have, again, that two different sort of resolutions, like a zoomed in and a zoomed out version of the texture that you're looking for, or at least a suggestion of it, so that you can use different textures on different parts of the body. So it's really nice right on the symmetry line because I can it sort of puts them over each other. And again, this isn't hyper realistic by any stretch. It's just giving me that idea of elephant skin. Oops, I want to be careful with that. So I'm going to switch back to that first one, the elephant skin fold, and I can use that because it's a finer texture. I can use that on the ears. And the fact that it's a little bit lower res is actually helping my favor. It's giving me that stippled effect. Again, every time I'm doing this, I'm just clicking it with the lock position on, clicking on the model, zooming, or start dragging my mouse out until I get something that looks good, and then releasing. We can add some to the legs back here. I don't want to go too overboard because sometimes that interplay between the dark and the light parts of the model is actually quite visually interesting. So how crazy how much of this you do is up to you, but I just wanted to give you an idea of how you could use that tool, that method. We even put some on the trunk here. I want to be careful because I do have the habit of going a bit overboard and making it too dark. So I'm going to, let's just call that good as the body. But now I still have these little toenails, which again are not perfect at all. Believe it or not, that's kind of the hardest part of this model. I'm going to now let's do something that's a little bit more, important, which are the eyes and the tusks. So easy for the tusks. I'm just going to, I'm going to select them. So see how as soon as I do that, the body goes dark. That means I'm not affecting it. And I'm going to hit shift, my shift key, and then click the other tusk so that they're both selected at once. They're both brighter, highlighted. And I'm going to go back up to my Matcap under rendering, and I'm going to select white. As soon as I do that, as you can see, they get a lot brighter, a lot whiter. And that's probably fine. I don't need to make them any more different than that because the fact that they have that shape and they have that differentiation between the body is probably enough for now. If you wanted to, you could add a little bit of a yellow tint to it because natural ivory, which is what tusks are, does tend to have a bit of a yellow tint to it. But again, I'm not looking for hyper realism here. Then I'll go over here. I'll go into the eyes. Again, they're separate spheres, so I have to rotate and then select both at once. And then I can, again, change the Matcap to white. Now they're also white. But the trick here is now I can actually give him a little bit of a pupil. It doesn't need to be anything more than either just a black dot, or if you want to get fancy, you can give him blue eyes. or I don't even know if elephant's going to have blue eyes, but it might be pretty. Or nice brown eyes, nice green eyes maybe. But let's see what happens. So if I now that I have, I'm going to select one of the eyes at once. This is the tricky part because it's not going to necessarily, um, it's not going to give you the same on the other side, other eyeball. You kind of have to be careful and do it the best you can. The symmetry kind of breaks down on multiple spheres, unfortunately. But if I I need to turn off my alpha because right now I still have a texture, right? See that? It's going to give it that skin on the eye, which is not what I want. So I have to go back down here under alpha and hit none. But a neat effect, because I still have black as the color. If I turn lock position off, which is part of the alpha, I can just draw, except my brush is way too big, so I'm going to turn the radius down. I could just draw on the eye like that, and it would follow my mouse. But if I want to just make one round black dot in the middle of the eye, if I can actually still use the lock position function under alpha without an alpha actually active, and that will let me just select one part of the eye, or the middle of the eye, pull out, and I can actually make a perfect circle that way. The problem is that right now, obviously, it's a little bit too light because my intensity is still down from when I was using the other tool. So I'll just turn my intensity all the way up. I'll try that again. And now I've given him a pupil, really. Obviously, there's no iris, but again, it's all really just stylized. If you wanted to, you could select a different color. You know, let's give him some sort of brownish eyes. I don't know how well it's going to read personally, but oops, not the color we wanted. I think the problem is I went off of paint, so I have to go back to paint. My mouse has about 15 buttons on it, so it can kind of mess me up sometimes. So let's just give him some sort of like a yellowish brown eye. Zoom right into the eyeball, like so. I guess it should be the other way around. The black dot should be in the middle. Maybe that makes him a bit manic looking. So you know what? Let's just leave the color out. Again, sometimes it's more about what you leave out than what you put in. So at least now the eye has something to kind of see. The eye has another eye to kind of walk into. So right away he looks a lot more alive. And again, elephants don't have very big eyes. If you wanted, you could exaggerate his eyes to give him make him look even more friendly. I think probably most of your creatures will probably have bigger eyes anyway. And same deal with the toenails, except it's a little bit awkward because they're all individual. So I'm just holding down Shift and going around and selecting all of the toenails at the same time. So that way I can go and just change the matte cap to white for all the toenails. And there we go. So for this model, at least, I think it's pretty much done. What I could do, obviously, is I could make the toenails a little dirty because they're, you know, on the feet. But right now, I think it's actually fine, at least for a quick, again, sketching with color. We're not looking for hyperrealism, although I do encourage you, if you do enjoy the process, put the time in. As long as you save it properly, I'll see that when I open the file. Now, that brings me to the most important part of this process, which is saving your work. I didn't save it once during this demo, but that's because I'm living dangerously, obviously. It could have crashed any time. But when it comes to saving, after you put all this work into adding color to your mesh, you do need to make sure that you're saving it in the right format. So I want to make sure I've clicked off export all. It should say OBJ color ZBrush. Now it's not ZBrush, but it's sort of using that format. And I want to make sure that I'm saving it as SGL or SculptGL, that first option up here. That's the only format that I've been able to get it to properly save the color information, unfortunately. So just make sure that that's what you're doing. I know at least one person had trouble saving as anything other than a PLY file, I believe, but that I don't think that'll save the color info, unfortunately. So just make sure that you save it as SGL, and then again, that's going to say it's just going to plop a different file into your download folder, and you have to rename that. We've discussed that before. It's a little bit annoying, but it does help us keep track of our files. And maybe just if I go to that file, I can move it to the right folder, and I can call this again elephant colored. So that way I know that I've added that color information to that version. And then when I open it up again, that because it's an SGL file, it's a native format for SculptGL, that will actually appear. So just to recap, again, the difference between the Matcaps, the materials themselves, the underlying material of the object, and the color, that does matter. So play with that. Just to show you, one of the links actually is just as another little fun thing to play with. Under DC Connect for this week, there should be a file called free sample matcaps. And if you download those that zip file and sort of open it up, you're going to get something like this, which has quite a few different and quite a few crazy, some of them more crazy than others, materials that you could play with. So that you can see there's one here that looks sort of like it's, well, a few that look like they're metallic. There's one that looks like it's some sort of plasma almost. Even one here called Toon Blue Edge, so it looks like a cartoon. So you can play with those, but if there's enough interest, we might look at how to make our own materials later on, our own Matcaps, these spheres. But if you look at these materials as they're sort of out of context, they're files, the actual the way they're constructed, you can see that they're all spheres, and they all have that a different kind of way of shading them. The highlights are in different places, which make them look a little bit sharper, a little bit harder than others, and some of them look softer and more diffuse. So that sort of gives you an idea of how these Matcaps are actually working. And you may actually find that if you have that, that curiosity, if you have that time and energy too, you can actually change these materials, these Matcaps, to work the way that you need them to. You can change the colors, you can change what the highlights are, you can make it look harder and shinier that way. So I'm going to go back to SculptGL. I'll just try some of these just to show you how crazy they can get. So here's our unassuming elephant. If I start to import some of those Matcaps that I just showed you, so if I go under rendering right here, it says just white, I can import just like I could with the brushes, the alphas. And if I go to those files, let's try something really crazy like this one called warmth. Now he looks like he's some sort of day-glow elemental creature. You can still see all the darker texture I painted on using that brush, but because this material has such a strong color presence already, it's kind of overriding all of the other work I did. Even though it does look kind of neat, it's sort of this day-glow, almost metallic neon material. So let's try a few more. Again, this is just for play. Here's one called Blue Glint. And now it looks like it's made out of some sort of latex, possibly. Or some sort of almost liquid material. Let's try a few more just for fun. Here's one that's, you know, fairly understated compared to the other ones, called Sunset. This sort of blood red one. And again, it looks very visceral, but this might be useful if you wanted to make something like the inside of the mouth, maybe a tongue. Maybe you wanted to make something that looked like it was bleeding. A little edgy there, but hey, I'm down for it. Um, this might be a way of doing that because it has such an interesting way of uh, altering not only the, you know, the visual nature of the object, but it also has quite an emotional impact as well. So just let's again, I don't want to spend all day on this, but you can sort of see that by just altering the Matcap, you can make something that's quite uh, something. Makes it look like more like a little troll doll or something. But again, very interesting because it has multiple highlights. As I turn the object, that green tends to move around. But obviously, all things have to come to an end, including the fun. So if I go back to white again, I'm back to that neutral base coat. So play around with that. See what you get. You don't have to change the material matte cap if you don't want to, but it is often a good idea. And I didn't even get into hardness and, you know, shininess and all that, but you can kind of get a good idea when you look at those sphere images how that might work. So I'm going to end the video here for this particular demo, but we'll also look at posing meshes, posing our creatures to give it a little bit more asymmetry, a little bit more visual interest. So it's not just a rigid, perfectly symmetrical posed creature, which looks a bit stilted sometimes. And we'll also look at a really basic way of getting this 3D work that we did into a 2D format to make a basic digital poster, which again is also optional. So that's it for this particular video.